Good morning, everyone. This is Michele Hughes from Ageless and Timeless. Today, we have a really wonderful guest. I want to tell you a little bit about him. We've known each other for about, I think, 20 years, huh, Graham?
Yeah, I think it's been that long.
Yeah, Dr. Graham Simpson, who is a doctor that everyone should know about because he's doing a lot of very important work, particularly with diabetes. And although he's really an anti-aging doctor, but so Graham and I met many years ago, and we've done some interactions, some actually business transactions together. And we were both involved with Dr. Stephen Sinatra and Dr. Barry Sears. We were going to start something that was very exciting, Graham, I thought anyway, was called the Zone Cafe, and it was after Dr. Sears's revolutionary breakthroughs in the zone, if people might remember that. And anyway, so the idea that Graham came up with, I think, was your concept, Graham, to start little zone cafes all over the country and using the zone diet. And well, anyway, the zone, you had one in Reno, right?
Yeah, that was a prototype, and it was doing actually reasonably well. And the whole concept was to, people love fast food, and then it's not going to stop. But we wanted to sort of make delicious fast food that, would help people with their nutrition, etc.
Right. Yeah. And so at that time, I was doing my real estate projects in Hawaii, and I was having a big birthday. I can't remember which number, but it was a big one. And we had the idea to bring the chef from the Zone Cafe, and we had a party for about, 500 people out on a huge property that we owned. It was 7,000 acres, and we took part of it and created like a zone evening. And it was hugely successful, particularly in Hawaii. I think that's an amazing accomplishment because many people there haven't quite arrived yet in terms of their nutritional enlightenment. So anyway, but they love the food, and we had a wonderful evening. And it was too bad, Graham, you couldn't come. We lit up this entire field, so much so that the planes coming in from Oahu had to divert. And we got a little bit of flack on that later, but anyway, they were all curious to see what all these lights were out in the middle of nowhere. So anyway, but that was our one of our first interactions with many others. So anyway, let me just give you a little background. So Dr. Simpson, you grew up in South Africa, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, born in Cape Town, and went to medical school in Johannesburg.
Right. And how did you happen to come to the United States?
Well, I went via England. My great-great-grandfather was Sir James Young Simpson, who invented chloroform. Actually, Queen Victoria's third child was done with chloroform. But I had contacts because of that at Hammersmith Hospital, and I was going to do obstetrics and gynecology. But I realized after a few months that I wasn't crazy about the weather and things, so I decided to move to the States, and that's where I went to.
And how did you get to Las Vegas, and then also California?
Yeah, I first started here in Vegas, and obviously I did internal medicine and emergency medicine and things, and that was sort of the first stop. And obviously, Vegas was kind of near and dear to me at one time. We used to run the early emergency rooms in Vegas. This was back in the late 70s. So, Sunrise and Southern Nevada Memorial, which became UMC, University Medical Center, were the ER. So I suppose the first part of my life for 20 odd years was in emergency medicine, looking for all the acute stuff. And then obviously I became more and more aware it's a lot easier to prevent, rather than try and cure, people. So, I transitioned about 20 years ago into, really a more integrated, preventive, proactive approach to medicine.
So what Who inspired you? Where did you get your mentoring and your early development in terms of choosing the alternative and holistic path versus the allopathic?
Yeah, I mean, when I was even in my emergency days, I was very curious. I don't know if you remember Jan Smuts. He was the one of the earlier presidents of South Africa, and he wrote a very interesting book called Holism and Evolution. In fact, the term holism, if you look it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica, actually refers to his concept of emergent life forms and, the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. And I suppose, reading some people like that, and there were a lot of early people, Rene Dubois and others who, were very instrumental. And we actually, I think back in the late 70s or, mid 70s, we actually, started a holistic health sort of conferences in San Diego. And a friend of mine, John Travis, who really had a lot to do with putting the word wellness on the map. Before that, the term wellness was used by a psychiatrist called Herbert Dunn. And John Travis sort of took some of the concepts, and he had a center in Mill Valley. This was back in the 70s. So, we were just starting to explore, what is wellness and what does wellness medicine mean? This was long before any wellness programs started at corporate wellness and all that type of thing. But Larry Chapman was one of the early pioneers, this was more than 30 years ago, introducing, and I think he's done thousands of presentations and sort of encouraged the whole wellness movement in the corporate world. So, there were countless people. I think one of my favorite people was Larry Dosey, because he was very much about the mind body and the non-local mind sort of aspects of medicine. So Larry, I met in Dallas over 30 years ago. And I think my latest book, actually, the one on Living Beyond 100, I actually dedicated to Larry. He was a real giant in the field. And there were many others. I mean, at that time when I met him in Dallas, I met a number of good nutritionists and other people in the exercise world. And it gradually over the years, particularly the last 20 something years, we've been very much interested in looking at some of the root causes of disease. And there's so much exciting material now happening with AI and machine learning and epigenetics and all these kinds of things. So it's been a gradual evolution, I think. And, really for the last 20 years or so, I've just practiced proactive medicine and been out of the traditional medicine.
Well, just curious, because I was going to mention your new book, Living Beyond 100. And I want to encourage our viewers to look. I believe it's on Amazon, right, Graham?
Yeah. There's a number. There are probably about 10 books, but the last one was Living Beyond 100, and sort of the concepts of living below 5 and then living beyond 100. Living beyond 5 is really the first step, I think, in anti-aging, because what's affecting us now, Michele, I mean, it's a pandemic of unprecedented kind of proportions, is that 88% of Americans are now insulin resistant. And basically, metabolic stress, which is insulin resistance, is responsible for 80% of the deaths that we see in humans worldwide. And also, what shortens your health span as well as your lifespan.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Gematria Products. Gematria is based in Carlsbad, California, and they manufacture ultra high quality dietary supplements using QI technology. Qi, as you probably know, is the energy that runs throughout our bodies and is the basis of Chinese medicine. Use the code AGELESS and get 20% off your order. I highly recommend Gemetria's products. I personally use the complete aminos, the heart gems, and the Methuselah Life, which is an RNA and DNA sublingual spray. The website to go to is www.gematria.com/QI-technology. And there you'll find out more about this fascinating company, their products, and the technology.
So let's define some of those terms because I think a lot of people get confused when we talk about metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and so forth. So let's just take a deep dive for us and start at the beginning and give us the overview. I just want to say as a preface to this that your book goes into a lot of detail for the layperson. So I encourage everyone who is dealing with this type of situation. If there's 88% of you out there, then that's a huge population. So in your book, you do define and you break down each of the blood tests that you can take that will measure your pre-diabetes, diabetes 2, insulin resistance, glucose metabolism, and so forth. So anyway, give us some definitions so we can be a little more educated.
Sure. So obviously, just let me preface, look, type 1 and type 2 diabetes are different. Type 1 diabetes is when obviously the pancreas that makes insulin is, destroyed often, in young people in their teens and things. So that's a different type of disease. And what I would like to refer to is mostly 95% of people have type 2 diabetes.
Correct.
And most of these people are fat. Insulin resistance drives obesity, and it drives diabetes, and it actually drives all chronic disease that we see. And this is because the insulin, type 2 diabetics have lots of insulin floating around, but it's so-called insulin resistance. It's not working in the body. So, a lot of people still give type 2 diabetics insulin. And to be honest, insulin to a overweight, diabesity, diabesity is really the combination of diabetes and obesity because they often coexist. But giving, insulin to a type 2 diabetic will actually increase their morbidity and mortality 22%. So, what the treatment of, diabetes and all these chronic diseases is really to regain insulin sensitivity and metabolic flexibility. The prime drivers of this pandemic globally that we're seeing, half the world is now fat, diabetic, and sick. So the drivers of this is quite simple. It's sugar, grains, and adulterated plant oils, but particularly sugar and grains. The average American is now eating 150 pounds of sugar a year and 200 pounds of grain and 5,000 teaspoons of adulterated oils. For instance, in England in the 1700s, the average Englishman or woman only ate 5 pounds of sugar, and it has increased tremendously. And you don't have to look far. If you look back, what happened, we were hunter-gatherers for 600,000 generations. And then about 10,000 years ago, we became agriculturists. That was the first time that grains and these things were planted. And we were sort of maybe 600 generations of agriculturists, of farmers. And then, obviously we had the modern diet, and obviously the ultra modern diet in the last, generation or so, which is, I believe, is the tipping point of what's happened. I don't know if you know this, Michele, but in 2019 figures, America, for the first time, our lifespan dropped by 2 years and 3 months. For me, that was the tipping point where ultra-processed food, and this, by the way, was before COVID. It had nothing to do with COVID. We actually dropped this. And this, I think, is because of this pervasive, more than 50% of the calories consumed by modern Americans is ultra processed food, which is extremely toxic. I mean, we now know that sugar, particularly fructose, many of us, I think in medical school and things, we thought, well, oh, fructose is just, natural sugar. It doesn't do any harm. Wrong. I mean, fructose is more toxic than glucose. And so, fructose goes straight to the livers to start giving you insulin resistance. I would say now 1 in 2 people in America have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. 1 in 2 people. It's just incredible. And 88% of the population is basically insulin resistance, meaning that on that downward spiral to, create lots of chronic disease. Most Americans, by the time they get into their late 50s and early 60s, have 1 or more or 2 or more chronic diseases. All these diseases, hypertension, strokes, heart attacks, cancer, Alzheimer's, ED. I mean, 75% of men with erectile dysfunction have basically diabetes. It is the major cause of these things. And often, once that ED happens, that's usually like the canary in the coal mine, which means that within, probably 4 or 5 years, that person's going to have a heart attack. So it's incredibly important for doctors to start connecting. The reactive disease medicine system is so screwed up. All you do with your diabetes now, you go to the doctor, and each year or every 6 months, he starts increasing usually more medication. The truth is, diabetes can be reversed in 4 to 6 weeks. I have another book called The 4-Week Diabetes Cure. But I'll tell you a funny story that maybe your listeners would find interesting. I mean, I spent about 10 years in the Middle East, and obviously had a lot of contact in India and in Pakistan and other places. But in India, we started using these little sugar glucose monitors. In those days, it wasn't like the Libre Freestyle where you could have your own little phone measure these sugars. In those days, it was the Libre Freestyle Pro. So what we would do is we'd put on a little sugar sensor. And if I saw you and you were the diabetic patient, I'd say, look, Michele, don't do anything. Keep taking your medicine, just eat your diet and, give me some idea, record your food a little bit and come back and see me in 4 days. And you'd come back and I'd look at your figures and, your sugar might be 200, 360, all over the place, but very high. And then I'd say to the person, look, for the next 4 days, I want you to eat off my green sheets. Green sheets were essentially a keto type diet. It was, high fat, moderate protein, low carbs. And I'd say, do me a favor, if you can, try and eat dinner early and breakfast late, i.e., intermittent fasting. And I'd say, look, why don't you come back in 4 days? I tell you, Michele, when I saw these things coming back, I thought these little sugar monitors weren't working, because they would come back in 4 days and their sugars would be normal. I thought to myself, oh my God, how did this happen? And sure enough, it shows you with just a little attention to the body has incredibly healing potential. In fact, in well-documented medical research, you can actually reverse 1/3 of your fatty liver in as little as 7 to 10 days. That's another shocking thing that I read, that, with very sophisticated tests looking at the amount of fat in the liver, nowadays, I don't know if you know this, but non-alcoholic fatty liver is the major reason people are having liver transplants. And we are seeing, bad fatty liver disease in teenage kids. And many of these, these young kids now have all got type 2 diabetes. So, it's an absolute global fiasco. And there's so much money being wasted in terms of more and more medication. They never look at the root causes of these disease, which is very frustrating. When I was in the ER in the old days, I mean, we'd have most of these people coming in with acute heart attacks and strokes and all this type of fat, diabetic, etc. And I want to say also at this point, fat does not cause heart disease. This was a myth by Ansel Keys in the 70s, basically a physiologist who never saw a patient in his life. And guess what? The average person going to his doctor and the cholesterol's a little raised, what does he do? He gets put on statins. Statins have 144 side effects. Not only that, it can cause diabetes, much higher incidence. Everyone on a statin has cognitive impairment. So, I mean, it's just amazing.
Not only cognitive impairment, but muscle atrophy.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and pain and all this type of thing.
They don't tell them to take CoQ10 or ubiquinol, which will help to offset the negative impact of the statin. And and
I mean, people don't realize, in fact, this is well proven. The higher your cholesterol is over the age of 50, the longer you live. You know, your brain is 65% plus cholesterol and things. All your membranes, every one of your trillions and trillions of cells is all, the membrane is all cholesterol. All your hormones come from cholesterol. I see people that come in to see me and they've got a cholesterol of 100, and they wonder why they can't get erections. They've got no testosterone, because this is where testosterone comes from. All your hormones come from cholesterol. So, I'm just so upset with the current healthcare system. It's just to me, it's an absolute debacle.
Well, you're absolutely correct, and it's very shocking that America, one of the the leader in the free world, has one of the worst healthcare systems. We're way down. What are we, number like 40 or something in the health?
We're actually number 44, and we spend more than twice, sometimes more than 3 or 4 times other countries, expense on our healthcare. I mean, I think in 21 it was $4.3 trillion. So, I mean, it's crazy, and then, having your bypass or something, $250,000. And it's interesting, countries like India, you can get a bypass for $5,000 with a better result than Mayo Clinic, 17% lower morbidity and mortality in India, because, again, India is a country also with, half the country is vegetarian. When you eat a vegetarian diet, generally speaking, you're at a much higher risk of getting diabetes and things like that. So, it's really an interesting thing. And anyway, what I wanted to say is, look, ideally you want to get your hemoglobin A1C below 5, your uric acid below 5, and also your fasting insulin below 5. For me, that's the toxic triad. And I want to really commend David Perlmutter on his book, Drop Acid, which is a great little book on uric acid. And you can see how toxic uric acid is. Uric acid only comes from 3 primary things. By far the most important is fructose, alcohol, and obviously very high purine meat, fish diets can do it. But that's the rare cause. Most of it is coming from fructose. And fructose is terribly dangerous, because not only does it give you insulin resistance by going straight to your liver, but it also poisons the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the common link between probably all metabolic diseases and mental diseases. I was very pleased to read a book by Christopher Palmer, a psychiatrist from Harvard, just a few months ago. It's a relatively new book, and it's called Brain Energy. But he points out, and I really believe this, and he makes a very good case for it, that all mental disease, from minor things like depression and anxiety, all the way to things like schizophrenia, major psychosis, and major depression, it's all related to the energy balance inside the brain. And this wasn't actually all that new. There was also a guy called John Wilson, who's just a family practitioner. But he had also collected, there were a couple of doctors at McLean University about 20, 30 years ago. But there was this whole group of 15 diseases, mental diseases, they couldn't really quite find the cause for. But I think that, John Wilson, I think is the name of the practitioner, who I actually haven't met, but I'd like to. He basically figured out that most of these people all had what he called carb syndrome. And it was basically, he's done probably 15,000 body fats. And remember, this is very important. Most doctors don't even have a body fat machine in their clinic. But your body weight and your BMI don't mean diddly squat. You have to know your percent body fat. A woman should not be more than 28%, and a man not more than 20%. Once that starts happening, you can guarantee they're insulin resistant and they're on their way to a whole host of chronic diseases. And I'm just shocked that, 99% of the doctors in the country do not have a body fat. And you can also get skinny fat. I learned this also in India. I see these young little 30-year-old girls, they look like little skinny waifs. And you'd put them on the body fat machine and suddenly you'd find they had 38% body fat. And so these are the so-called skinny fat. They call them TOFIs, thin on the outside but fat on the inside. And these people all have metabolic syndrome as well. So it's very interesting. I also want to say something about metabolic syndrome. Look, animals, and this wasn't my idea, but I think Davis said this, but the animals, they actually develop metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. Why? For instance, Eskimos, they eat, or bears, they're eating all the fruit and things in the summer, and then they obviously go and hibernate and they have their little offspring. And, for 4 or 5 months, the bear doesn't eat. Basically, he's living off his fat. So they actually burn ketones. I mean, and it's also very surprising. I often wondered about that. How do bears pee? Well, they don't, because ketones are very clean fuel, and it's probably our major fuel. Glucose is like a secondary. I think we have evolved primarily, and everything works better, particularly our mitochondria. So the point is that animals turn on this fat switch, which is in the mitochondria, and they accumulate fat. But then in the winter time, like Eskimos, not the Eskimos, but like penguins sitting on their egg, in the Arctic there for they can live, the penguins, emperor penguins can live at least 4 months without any food. They all develop metabolic syndrome. In fact, even a hummingbird eating fructose all day, he develops liver, fatty liver, and then overnight the fatty liver disappears. So this is a normal process, but in humans, we don't turn the fat switch off. The hibernating bear, or the hummingbird or the penguin, they turn their fat switch off. Humans, we do not turn our fat switch off. Most Americans now are eating 6 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, supper, mid-morning snack, mid-afternoon snack, evening snack. No wonder 54% of Americans are diabetic or pre-diabetic. It's just absolutely nuts.
Mm-hmm. So on fructose, Graham, on the fructose issue, because I think a lot of people, don't really know what is fructose. So can you just give us a little list of those no foods?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, it's not just fructose. I mean, I just want to say something about these artificial sweeteners. These things are totally toxic. I mean, we knew this from the 60s and 70s, where, they gave mice, Coke and Diet Coke in 2 groups, and the Diet Coke rats get fatter. And we see this in some of the fattest clients we have around the world are, drinking 6 or 8, 10 Diet Cokes a day and things. So, it's not just fructose. These are artificial sweeteners, but they have their main effect in the microbiome, which we can talk about a little later. But the microbiome is incredibly important. Most humans don't know that they are 50% bugs and 50% human, and you've got much more genetic material in your microbes in your gut. But anyway, getting back to the foods. Look, 1 serving of basmati rice is 10 teaspoons of sugar. 1 glass of freshly squeezed orange juice is 7 teaspoons of sugar. A medium banana is 7 teaspoons of sugar. Now, here's the important thing. A normal healthy amount of sugar for a woman is 6 teaspoons a day. You have your glass of orange juice, you've already exceeded. And as soon as you go above 6, and a man, 9 teaspoons of sugar, you start developing fatty liver disease, just like the penguins and the bears. So, I mean, this is just, crazy. We've got so much, sugar coming in, all, 150 pounds plus per person per year, plus the 200 pounds of grain that also all turns into sugar. So it's no wonder, our lifespan, our health spans are being so totally, corrupted. So the LB5, LB100 plan that we do, the LB5 has to be to reverse this insulin resistance by basically we are now using some of these peptides like, semaglutide, but basically a well-formulated keto diet, some intermittent fasting, some semaglutide, a little walking every day. And, basically we use a couple of supplements that are very effective. And I mean, you literally can cure your diabetes, literally, and we do it every day. We've got thousands of patients who've done it. And basically, once you do that, you can then look towards, all the longevity and emerging longevity sort of techniques that, you're very interested in, I know, with your podcasts and things, but it doesn't make sense to spend all the money on these longevity techniques unless you've got your hemoglobin A1C and insulin and uric acid, down under control. Normal uric acid for a woman is 3.5 and for a man 4.5. And, most of the people I see, uric acid and fasting insulins and A1Cs are way, 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 way high.
And the other thing then for the normal person who doesn't want to ever hear the word type 2 diabetes, then should they stop eating fruit if they're totally healthy but they don't want to incur a future with type 2 and fructose being the root cause? Would that mean that all fruit has to get off the diet, or are there any fruits low glycemic?
So look, there are obviously you got some good tables that show obviously some berries and
like blueberries.
Blueberries, red berries, strawberries. The red berries have and the blackberries are all fine, but that it has to be in moderation as well. You can't be having a big bowl of berries every morning for breakfast. But the other thing is that you were mentioning what to do, should people eat fruit? Look, there's also clearly a small genetic component. I mean, I would say 15 to 20%. And most of it is epigenetic. It's mostly your lifestyle that contributes. But, if both your parents and your grandparents and everyone had diabetes, that would indicate to me, look, there's some genetic propensity here. And we can measure this now with methylation data quite easily. But those people should probably be very cautious with the amount of fruits that they eat. And again, these sugar monitors are great for showing, what happens to your blood sugar after you have, a bowl of berries or a couple of oranges or something like that. So there are ways of easily measuring this. But generally speaking, some fresh fruit, added to the diet, particularly some of the low glycemic fruits, some people can have, but if 88% of the population is insulin resistant, well, that's your answer. How can you start eating lots of fruit? I mean, you can't.
And so I know online there are NEMDR charts that show the glycemic index. So I guess one first step for a lot of people who are proactive about their health and preventing type 2 diabetes would be to copy that glycemic index.
And remember, that comes with the glycemic load. The glycemic load is actually more important than the glycemic index. But so you really need both, to see. But yes, it's a good indication, and those tables are, freely available. I mean, when you look at the grams of carbohydrates, which I think are the most important of the macronutrients to count. And remember, I mean, just information is that, look, carbs is what drives your insulin way, way high. Protein, if you eat too much, you can get a bump in your insulin from the protein. But the only macronutrient that doesn't bump your insulin is fat. Fat is really your friend. Healthy fat is really what we need. And this is where I'm, incredibly mystified by Ansel Keys, because of his results, which were not correct, his so-called 22 and then became 7 country study. This is where the dietary guidelines of America came from, because he had this postulate that, your plumbing problem, your cholesterol builds up in your arteries, you have a heart attack, which is absolutely nonsense. But here's the thing: we changed, the government changed, and basically Keyes was directly responsible for us decreasing our fat intake to about 30-35% and increasing our carbohydrates to 55% or more. The old, that little triangle where, this was the pyramid, the food pyramid. Even the American Heart Association was saying you have to eat 6 to 12 servings of carbohydrates and, all this, and, drink some fruit juice and all this stuff. I mean, we are basically poisoned, not only America, but the rest of the world. So this was such bad advice. And you can see the amount of diabetics, heart disease, and all these things track as we change the macronutrients of our diet.
And remember Pritikin and Dr. Dean Ornish. I bet, I'm pretty sure Dr. Ornish, who lives here in Sausalito, right next door to me, and where I am in Tiburon. He rented my house in Hawaii one time, and I remember having a conversation with him about his change of belief systems, because he was one of the originals that was the low fat, no more than 10% of fat in your diet daily was the kind of mantra that was guiding people back then.
Yeah, and it was really, I mean, Pritikin, these things, it was well-meaning, and obviously cutting out a lot of the crap out of the diet, which they did, helped them. But, the truth is, men who eat just a 10% low-fat diet, like Pritikin and Ornish and these guys, they actually, 4 out of 5 men will have an atherogenic profile, with small LDL, and, you can measure this now, fairly accurately. And then, very interesting, if you go up to, 20% or 25% of fat diet, instead of 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5 people, men have an atherogenic. And then people who are eating 45% plus, only about 1 out of 5 men have an atherogenic profile. So we know, look, hunter-gatherers, there's very little archaeological evidence, anthropomorphic evidence, any kind of evidence to show that humans ever ate just a pure plant-based diet.
Right.
So there is some truth that as we get older, because of nutrient sensors like mTOR, which, we don't want to eat too much red meat. I think as we get into our, 60s and 70s, you want to maybe eat a little more fish, a little more plant-based diet. But, I really believe that for most of human history, at least for the last, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, several 100,000 years, I mean, we always ate, some, meat and fish and berries and fruit and things. And, we were omnivores. I mean, I believe that. I know some people go to the extreme now. They do carnivore diets. Yes, there are a lot of good things, but there are also, a number of deficiencies. And, there's the same thing with vegans. Those are the two extremes. So I think somewhere in between is what makes sense. And the other thing I think is so important, and I learned this from, I think, Tim Noakes in South Africa. One of his great books was called, Real Nutrition. And I think if you eat real food, not packaged or boxed or tinned, or, if you eat real food, you largely will, limit the amount of sugars and things you put in into your body.
So let's talk about the healthy fats, because we don't want people to listen to what you're saying today and think, oh, I can go eat canola oil or safflower oil or some of these trans fats that are very unhealthy. So give us a short list of the healthy fats that should be including in our diet daily.
Sure. So, also the other whole thing about, monosaturated, polysaturated fats, et cetera, et cetera. But a couple of important points. Look, when you cook, you don't want to use olive oil. Olive oil is great cold on your salads and things like that, but you want to cook with butter. I usually advise people to get, the Kerrygold grass-fed Irish butter, which is good to cook with, or what Indians use, which is ghee. The ghee, some people don't like the taste of ghee, but ghee has a very high smoke point. The reason you don't want to use plant oils of any, there are a couple you can use. You can cook with coconut oil or avocado oil, but all things like Pam sprays and canola and safflower oils and olive oil, you don't want to heat. Olive oil, with a little balsamic or lemon juice, great on your salads. But you do that because the only time cholesterol maybe does any, bad things to you is if you oxidize the fats there with heat, you can get, more of these LDL particles, the smaller ones that can get, under your endothelium and things. But for the most part, healthy fats, from meat, from fish, from yogurt. I like yogurt also for the microbiome. The microbiome loves fermented foods. And obviously you want to get yogurt without all the berries and things because they tend to be very, very high. So you just have plain phage yogurt or Greek yogurt. And, things like that are healthy. And butter, believe it or not, is, I know there was a Time magazine picture, which was great. They had a piece of bread with a butter on top. Well, if you believed Keyes, you'd never eat a block of butter in your life. And, you'd eat the carbohydrate, which is absolutely wrong. You're better off eating the butter than you are the carbs. And also remember, all the flour now most of it is now contaminated with glyphosate, Roundup. So it's very toxic. Roundup is tremendously toxic to the microbiome. 1 in 6 people now supposedly have some type of autoimmune disease, and all this autoimmune disease comes from a leaky gut, which is very much related to, what we're eating. And obviously people should be careful of taking PPIs and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories and antibiotics. All this is incredibly toxic to the microbiome, which is very, very, very important. Right. The mitochondria also terribly. I believe in all the hallmarks of aging that Carlos Lopez published in 2013. He had 9 hallmarks of aging. And obviously the microbiome wasn't actually included there because it was still new and, research was just coming out. But, those 10 hallmarks of aging to me are all affected by metabolic stress, which is insulin resistance, and psychological stress. That is the major reason we age. We get premature disease, our health span is shortened, and our lifespan is shortened. So, and I'd also like to mention something. I don't know how much time we have left, Michele. We have a few minutes to talk about epigenetics.
Yes. Let's see. We have 15 minutes, so we're good.
Oh, okay, good. So look, epigenetics, let me explain. Genetics, we finished, I think, the Human Biome Project from 1990. I think it was 2003. And we thought, oh, okay, now we've deciphered all the DNA, that we should be really able to cure a lot of metabolic and chronic and, all these diseases. But to be honest, we've really come up short. There's very little evidence that we have to date that many of the things we die from is directly related to the genetic, the genes are the hardware. What we now realize, like I often tell patients, genes load the gun, but your lifestyle pulls the trigger. Your lifestyle is basically the epigenetics, which was described by Waddington back in the 40s, but epigenetics means above the gene. And what we now know is that genes are turned on and off all day long, all the cells. And what turns them on are these epigenetic things. And so, for instance, just to give you a little short thing, look, in 2013, Steve Horwath from UCLA had a pan tissue clock. It was the first age clock, but it didn't actually measure so much your biological age. It measured your chronological age. And then Morgan Levine from Yale in about 2019 had a second generation clock, which was where she took, 9 different things, and there was some correlation. They looked at what methylation things were causing disease and what it want. But the one I really want to talk about as a plug for a friend of mine, basically Ryan Smith at True Diagnostic. I believe that Ryan has the best age clock currently out there. I don't like David Sinclair's one, Tally Health. They don't have the data and research that Ryan Smith has. And they measure basically 950,000 CPG units on your DNA. And they give you a nice 76, 80-page report. And what is the most important thing I find there is you can measure your pace of aging. That means normally, if you think about chronological and biological age, normally it's like 1-to-1, right? You get 1 year older, you're 1 year biologically, your organs are 1 year younger. Well, it's not true. We now know, and you see this every day, Michele, you'll see people, they're 40 years old and they look like they're 70 and vice versa. You'll see some people 70 and they look like they're in their 40s. So this is the phenotypic biological aging, what's happening. And here's the most important thing. If you can, because age is your biggest risk factor for chronic disease and death. But if you can lower your biological age by just 7 years, you can lower your risk of all chronic disease by more than 50%. So let me just tell you a little bit about pace of aging. I think your listeners would find it interesting. The pace of aging study was actually done because of people from Dunedin, which is in the South Island of New Zealand. Back in 1976, they took about 1,500 people that were born, and they've been following them now for over 50 years. And what they did, they looked at a lot of the markers. It might have been grip strength or your gum health or your brain health. And, they're doing MRIs and doing all these studies on these people. And they correlated and showed how people, by adopting some healthy lifestyle changes, you can actually slow down up to 6 months in any 1 year. You can slow down your biological age. If you're screwing up and you're drinking and eating too much and stress and too much fructose and all these things, too much alcohol, you actually advance your biological age by 4 years. So I don't think anti-aging will be able to be practiced without using something like True Diagnostic Test. Because you want to know, if you're going to your doctor for an anti-aging program or you're taking a bunch of these nutraceuticals or pharmaceuticals, you want to know that these things are making a difference. It's slowing down your biological age, which should really be the goal, of any anti-aging program. So, I'm excited, and I'm embarking now on a study where we're looking at seeing, just with our Live Below 5 program, where we can, put people on a program just for 3 months. I believe once we start, dropping all some of these blood biomarkers like hemoglobin A1C and things, I believe very strongly that we are going to see marked changes in biological age in a very short space of time, which we've never been able to see before. So I really think that people are going to hear a lot about epigenetics in the years ahead.
So what do you think about measuring telomeres and the DNA? Do you feel that that's also the hallmark?
No, I mean, look, I love the book by the lady, what was her name, Elizabeth Blackburn, and also the gal from UCLA. The telomere effect. And right. What was very interesting in that book, which also I think validates some of my thinking, is that the metabolic stress and psychological stress definitely, they showed, shortens your telomeres. And obviously, shorter telomeres, you probably have a higher risk of dying. However, the telomere, which, by the way, True Diagnostic measures the telomeres, but they are not as predictive and as accurate for truly measuring biological age. It is somewhat correlated, but not as well as these epigenetic tests. But in the telomere effect, I think what was very interesting is you could see that if you had a parent with Alzheimer's and you were the primary caregiver, or if you had a some child that had some bad sort of medical issues, and you were the prime care. These people's telomeres shorten because of the psychological stress that these people felt. You probably, I don't know if you've ever had someone or a parent with Alzheimer's and things. It's a tremendously, you can't leave some of these people alone. You have to be with them pretty much 24/7. So it is a tremendous stress on the body. And I think the whole mind body thing, which we've only really been that aware of in the last 50, 60 years, is tremendously important. I mean, every thought you have in your head registers a physical effect in your body. So I don't think, the DNA testing per se, yes, it'll give you some ideas, but I think the epigenetic test is where the gold is.
Mm-hmm. So before we run out of time, I just want to go back to two things. You said so much that, that we could spend 3 hours just going over what you've talked about, but just so that people don't forget. So let's go back first to the fructose. So I just want to be sure that people know that they can eat fruit, just don't eat a lot of fruit, and don't make that the primary focus. Like there was a time, remember, when people were fruitarians and they were eating only fruit, and that was like totally devastating to health. So just, recognize that you cut back on the number of fruits that you eat in a day, but don't give up eating fruit. The second thing you said on the oils or on the fats is to be sure to cut out all the fats that are not polyunsaturated. So you want to keep olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, butter, which is, if it's grass-fed butter, all the better. Or
grass-fed meats, wild fish, nice salmon, tuna, and things like that. Nice fatty fish, sardines, all that type of thing. All very, very healthy. And the trans fats are the thing. And I understand the government is trying to get trans fats out of our system, but most frozen foods and these frozen pizzas and all these type of things, they have a lot of cookies, cakes, all these things. They have a lot of trans fats in them, and that's what you want to stay away from.
Excuse me, Graham, but isn't one of those that is dangerous? Isn't that palm oil that you see in a lot of the baked goods? That
yeah,
really bad.
Yeah, I think that's not necessarily a healthy fat either. But again, fats are important. Eating healthy fats, and I think people have to get it. Everyone knows their cholesterol level, but who knows what their fasting sugar is, which is far more important. You need to know your fasting. If you look at your fasting sugar and your fasting insulin, you can multiply those and divide by 405. Only about 10% of people have their HOMA-IR test. That's an insulin-resistant test. And you want to have that below 1.2. Most people are above that. 88%, 90% of Americans are above 1.2. Under 1.2 means you have metabolic flexibility and insulin sensitivity, which is...
What is that test again? What's it called?
Called the HOMA-IR test. And it's very easy. HOMA. You could look it up in people's, WhatsApp or whatever. I mean, on the Google.
But should you ask your doctor to include that in any blood work?
Yeah, you should. You want to multiply the fasting sugar, a person's fasting sugar by the fasting insulin, and divide the product by 405, and hopefully you're less than 1.2.
Okay, that's very helpful. Well, the other thing that I wanted to mention is on cholesterol. So people should understand that your absolute cholesterol, which is what a lot of doctors base their pharmaceutical statin drug prescriptions on, it's not the measure of predictive of heart disease. So as Graham mentioned, if you have cholesterol over 200, let's say 212, which is what mine was last time, you shouldn't panic, because it's really the size of your particles. And that's where the LDL, the low density lipoproteins, come in. I don't want to take, away from what you would say about this, Graham, but I just want to keep it simple for people to understand that when you go to your doctor, make sure that they're doing the tests that measure the particle size and also that you get your ratio, your LDL to, HDL, high density is the good and low density is the bad. So can you just add to that to make sure?
I mean, what's much more important is your triglycerides. Triglycerides, which is the other blood fat, which they measure in your lipid panel, is 6 times more predictive of heart disease than cholesterol. And also looking at your triglyceride HDL ratio, if that's above 2, you're a little in trouble. And if it's I see most people with diabetes, their triglyceride HDL ratios are very much close to 3 or even a lot higher than 3. So triglycerides are the key thing. The other thing, I've never seen any convincing evidence that putting a woman on a statin has ever increased her life by 1 year or 6 months.
Right.
So I think, yes, if you've had a heart attack and you've had a stent and a bypass, these people, yes, and you're probably taking it not for your cholesterol, you're taking it because statins have some anti-inflammatory effect, which they've more recently recognized. But for people who haven't had a heart attack, you can easily correct everything just with a decent, well-formulated keto diet. In fact, studies from the Verta group show that 24 out of 26 of your risk factors go down when you implement a well-formulated keto diet with a little intermittent fasting. So, I think people are just, terribly excited about the cholesterol. And for me, it's a non-issue.
Okay. Well, I just got the signal that we've run out of time, but I just want to be sure to tell people how to reach you, Graham, because I know you're doing so much good work. And, there are people that could consult with you long distance if they want to. I'm sure you could do it on Zoom, right? With some people that
we do a lot of that, and we've got some good health coaches as well as certified docs. So we obviously want to reinvent healthcare in a way which is really our mission is to democratize healthcare globally. I mean, that's really our mission.
So could you just give us the correct contact info so the people can reach out to you? And
the easiest is just probably Graham at lb5100.com. Graham, Graham, lb5100.com.
Okay, so LB5100 is the name of your new enterprise, right? That you're working on, and that means live below 100, which is
live below 5 to live beyond 100. That's how we get the lb5100.com. That's what we're about. And we've been doing it for probably 4 or 5 years in many countries outside the US, but we're just opening in a number of centers throughout America at the moment.
Okay, good. So, and I know that your CEO has contacted me from Australia. Her name is Sarah, and she and I are working on some incentives for the viewers today. We'll put that on my website. I don't want to get into the complicated part of that, but it's very generous, and I know that people will be interested. So please check my website under Michele Recommends, and that's at www.agelessandtimeless.com, and that would be under Graham's our podcast today, which will probably air in another maybe week or so. So I want to say goodbye to everybody, and thank you so much, Dr. Simpson. We've had an amazing discussion today. You know so much.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I love to get some of the new information out to people. So
well, information is power, right? And you certainly have a powerful message to tell to the world. So have a wonderful day, everybody. And don't forget to subscribe and like the podcast and like this channel if you could. And we will see you again in another week. Take care. Bye-bye.